If there is one thing that is certain to elicit controversy and comments in Nigeria's governance space, it is the yearly signing of the budget. Africa's most populous country and biggest economy, Nigeria, exited its deepest recession in 4 decades in 2021. This was the country's second recession since 2016. Nigeria's economic situation has become worrisome in the past few years, and the budget becomes much more critical in planning the nation's finances. The 2022 appropriation bill was signed into law by President Muhammadu Buhari on December 31, 2021. While the presidency submitted a proposal fiscal budget of 16.391 trillion naira to the National Assembly, Nigeria's lawmakers raised it to 17.127 trillion naira, an increase of 735.8 billion naira. And that was what President Buhari signed into law. Analysts, economists, and more have been going through the budget with a fine-tooth comb, and several issues have come up. These include allegations of duplicate projects, padding, and inflated contracts. To get through the numbers and make sense of it all, I have Iniobong Usen joining me on this NC Exclusive. He is a senior research and policy analyst with Budget Nigeria. Budget is a civic organization that uses technology to simplify the budgets and materials of public spending for citizens, with the primary aim of raising standards and transparency and accountability in government. Iniobong, welcome to NC Exclusive. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, good afternoon, Tolu, and thanks for having me.
So let's start with my first note in the introduction. There is controversy that seemingly surrounds Nigeria's budget process and budgets year after year after year. Why is this controversy something we see all the time when it comes to how Nigeria organizes its finances?
So why you always find the budget season so contentious? It's because aside the Constitution, the next most important document you would find in any republic is the budget, because that's the document that contains how governments convert their policies and political commitments into how they intend to raise and spend revenues. Therefore, you would find out that year in, year out, whenever issues of the budget come out or happen, you find several stakeholders become very interested in the budget process.
So Budget released a statement after reviewing the appropriation bill, and Budget said in its preliminary analysis of 21,108 capital projects that were approved, you found 460 duplicated projects amounting to 378.9 billion naira. So what do you mean by duplicate projects? Take us through this.
So Budget has a mechanical way of scrutinizing the budget. We look at the budget, all the MDAs domiciled in the budget, look at the line items, line item by line item. And the duplications we had discovered in this year's budget, right, were of two types. First was duplications by the ERGP codes and duplications by line items. Now, what do I mean by duplications by the ERGP codes? Now, the ERGP codes are unique identifiers for capital projects in the budget. The budget is usually drawn from rolling plans, so the development plans. So for the ERGP, what it means is Economic Recovery and Growth Plan. And that plan expired in 2020. And all of the capital projects in the budgets between 2018 and 2021, and even this current 2020 to 2022, drew from the policy objectives of that development plan. Now, in each year's budget, those ERGP codes are supposed to be tied to just one capital project. But what we found in this year's budget is that there were situations where two different projects were tied to one ERGP code. So you had one code that was supposed to be a unique identifier for one project being assigned to two different projects. And that can be likened to two students in a university having the same matriculation number. And the implication for that is that when these accounts have to be retired, the requirements are that the retirements are done by the ERGP code. So if I have one ERGP code with two budget line items, I would have to only retire one of the ERGP codes. And whatever happens to the allocations, that have been released to that particular MDA for the second ERGP code, there's very little that the government can do to hold the MD accountable for such. The second type of duplication we experienced in the budget was by line items. And an example of that could be that maybe you could see a line item that states that the government or the Ministry of Works has decided to tar a 1 kilometer road in Ovo Crescent, for instance. So that can appear twice in the budget, right, with separate allocations. So the duplications were of two types. One by the unique identifier, which is the ERGP codes for capital projects, and two by line items in the budget.
Okay, so Iniobong, this is not the first time that budget has pointed out the presence of duplicated projects in Nigeria's budget. Particularly, it happened even just the year before. So what happened in 2021 when this was pointed out to the federal government?
When this was pointed out to the federal government, I think the budget office went to work, and several accountability units within the framework of the federal government also went to work. I'm sure you saw in the news that the ICPC verified over 200 of those projects that we had identified as duplicated projects. And the budget office confirmed over 100 of those projects and had stated that the budget office would withhold about 20 billion naira that were supposed to go to the implementation of those particular projects. So from our interventions in the previous year, we could see some sort of successes attained with that particular intervention in that year.
And some of what we also heard was that the money for some of these duplicate projects was not released in 2021. But I have to ask you, is that actually enough? Doesn't it also give a false sense of how much the budget is actually worth and where money is going when we continue to have instances of duplicated projects showing up in the budget?
I agree with you. It's definitely not enough. There has to be a deterrent for these kinds of infractions in the budget. The Fiscal Responsibility Act stipulates how stewards or how government officials or public or civil servants are supposed to act. And so when you have a situation where year in, year out, civil servants or public servants, right, find a way of duplicating projects in the budget without any deterrent, it just leaves room for other civil servants or public servants to year in, year out, continue to duplicate these line items in the budget. So for us to have a lasting solution to this problem, especially for the mistakes made on the executive side, right, there would have to be deterrents for these kinds of actions by public servants within the system.
So your answer is actually leading me into my next question, because I want you to help us paint a picture. What do you think this really says about Nigeria's budgeting process when in 2022, you're still finding duplicate projects, even though an issue such as this was flagged just the year before? And of course, we know it's the president and the presidency that, in a way, oversees the entire thing when it is finally presented to the National Assembly. So what kind of picture does that paint for you?
So before I go to the kind of picture it paints, I think I need to clarify certain points. So for this year's 2022 budgets, the bulk of the duplicated projects were actually discovered after the budget had passed through the National Assembly and had returned to the president for assent. I know you would recall that in the president's speech, he had stated that there were about 6,500 plus new projects, capital projects, inserted in the budget by the National Assembly members. And from the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development alone, over 1,500 projects were inserted by the National Assembly members. So for this year's budget, we're actually putting the blame, at the foot of the National Assembly. I know the jury is still out on the constitutional powers granted the National Assembly to be able to appropriate on budgets. But I think we need a judicial statement on the scope of appropriation, that, allows the National Assembly to be able to work on the budget so that we don't have this sort of scale of occurrences of duplications, right, in the budget of future years.
Okay. So another issue that budget has flagged with the 2022 appropriation bill is that of inflated projects. It's reported that Nigeria has lost billions of naira to this issue. Why are we seeing inflated projects in the budget, and why is it such a big deal for a country such as Nigeria?
It's a big deal because these budgets are not prepared in isolation. Recently, the federal government passed released the National Development Plan, which is supposed to be the rolling plan for Nigeria's development between 2021 and 2025. And all of the line items in the proposed budget, right, were supposed to speak to the policy objectives of that particular development plan. But what we saw with the approved budget was that a lot of MDAs, right, were allocated projects that were outside their mandates. So for instance, for the Federal University in Okana, they had projects to supply educational materials to schools in Onitsha. They had projects to construct streetlights in Enugu. They had empowerment projects for youths and women also in Enugu. If you look at the Federal University Kashere, they had budget line items for the acquisition of a guest house in Asokoro. So these sort of infractions in the budget, it's deep into the envelope for all of these different sectors of the economy. If you look at that National Development Plan, you would see that for the 5 years, right, for the health sector, for instance, about 1.6 trillion naira had been allocated for projects in that particular sector. As it is, the infant mortality rate now is about 78 to about 100,000 births, right? You have doctor to patient ratio at about 30 to 1,000, nurses to patient ratio of about 118 to 100,000. So on several health indicators, Nigeria is actually performing poorly. And that begs the question as to why projects that are outside the mandate of a lot of these core critical MDAs, right, have been allocated to these MDAs, when we know that these allocations would eat deep, right, into the envelopes of these MDAs, and it rubbishes, the development plan generally of the country.
I want us to stay on that because part of what you also flagged was the capacity of some of these ministries, departments, and agencies to carry out some of these projects assigned to them. So is it a situation of some of these projects being absolutely unnecessary, or they are necessary and they're being assigned to the wrong MDA? Or is it a combination of the two that we're seeing?
Again, I would draw my response from the response of the president. The president also stated that there were insertions, right, projects that were meant, by the framers of the Constitution, meant to be carried out by subnational governments. So that's projects to be carried out by the state governments and the local governments. And that would entail internal roads, right, provision of street lights. So when you have these sort of projects in the budget, right, it works at cross purposes with the strategic plan of the government. And this doesn't augur well for the country, especially if you consider the fact that the bulk of this, the bulk of the budget, right, will be implemented with funds that would either be borrowed from the domestic market, right, or from foreign capital markets, or from increase in taxes. I know you're also aware that it's the plan of the federal government that by the middle of this year, subsidy on petroleum would have been taken out. And also, we've also experienced or seen increases in excise taxes on carbonated drinks. So the bulk of this budget will be funded both by Nigerians and by public debt acquired. And that's the more reason why every stakeholder needs to take a critical look at these budgets and ensure that the proper thing is done.
All right, Iniobong, as we wrap up, it seems obvious that there is corruption and some kind of mismanagement and lack of oversight and transparency, as well as accountability in Nigeria's budgeting process. These loopholes cost the country, and they also put an undue burden on citizens and also cost them. How can these loopholes be closed?
First, with this year's budget, is for there to be an amendment. That is one. The government has stated that a lot of the new insertions, which were over 6,500, were outside the strategic plan of the government to sort of to stimulate economic growth, reduce income inequality. So for us to be able to stay on course with this 5-year development plan, there needs to be an amendment to ensure that whatever is going to be implemented would be in line with the development plan. Secondly, right? There needs to be a judicial pronouncement on the powers of the National Assembly to be able to make insertions in the budget. Without this, year in, year out, we will find a situation where the executive would painstakingly, establish a budget or create a budget, send it to the National Assembly for review, and we would have these sort of instances where there are insertions in the budget. Thirdly, there has to be strong accountability mechanisms in place, right? People have to be held accountable for their actions. For the ICPC that had identified that over 200 of those projects, right, that were identified by budget in 2021 were actually true. What has been done to the officers, right, in a lot of these MDAs that were responsible for this project, So we expect that there has to be strong deterrence, right, very firm deterrence to ensure that these sort of things do not occur in the future.
All right, so we'll leave it at that for now. We hope that there will be some kind of update to see what happens with the duplicated projects that have been flagged. Iniobong Usen, Senior Research and Policy Analyst with Budget Nigeria, thank you so much for joining me on this NC exclusive.
Yeah, and thanks to Tolu for having me.
All right, so we'll see you again soon. You've been watching NC exclusive right here on News Central. I'm Tolu Lokwe Adeleru Balogun.